Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here in my wormery, and when I was down here a few minutes ago earlier, I was just looking things over, and there was one bin over there, the one on the other end of this shelf, this one right here, that I couldn't really get my head around for some reason. I came down here, I was looking at it, I went upstairs and I went up to my tracking spreadsheet to figure out what was going on with it. It was labeled off as if it had been harvested already, but it's clearly here. It's clearly up on the shelf. It's clearly got a label on it. Usually once I harvest a bin, I remove the label. And I just couldn't, for the life of me, figure out what it was doing here or what the next steps were. And then I had to actually go back to the last video I shot in which this bin made an appearance. It was 9 days ago at this point. And only after watching the video did I manage to refresh my memory on what had happened with this bin. Basically, what had happened was we'd gone into this bin, we pulled whatever worms had been congregating in the feeding zone that we had set up. The attempt was to try to lure the worms out of the finished compost and migrate them so that we can have a tub of just finished compost after we remove the worms. And those worms actually went down into this tub over here on the bottom, my newest bin. And that was actually the inception of that brand newest bin, which is now 9 days old. But it was only after I had reviewed my video on my last interaction with this bin to refresh my memory on what the game plan had been, because it had totally slipped my mind, and it's just been sitting here for 9 days without any sort of resolution to the ambiguity. And the ambiguity here was what to do next. I did make certain references in that last video to sleeping on it, flipping a coin, deciding later, and in the end, after the worms had been removed, the material just went back up on the shelf to continue airing out. And I believe that the main issue with this material was that it was, at that point worm-free, but it was still too damp to be useful. It was just clumpy and muddy, and I think the whole idea was to at least let it dry, to let it become a little bit more manageable and flaky, hopefully, and then also eventually decide what to do with it in the end. So we're just going to get this thing up onto the bench and take a closer look at how the material's coming along, try to come up with some sort of a game plan on what to do with this stuff. I would think that after 9 days it would have dried out pretty good, and I can certainly feel on the surface the material's got some pretty dry, hard consistency. You've even got these little cracks occurring in certain places as the material dries. Maybe it's shrinking, I guess. But as I press on it, I could feel the softness of the material right below. So we've found recently that if we take the really dry stuff that's been airing out on the surface and we combine it with the material that's below, which is usually a little bit more damp, then we end up with a good mixture where the overly damp stuff basically transfers some of its excess moisture into the more dry stuff, and then we have a much better overall batch of compost in the end. So that's really what I'm going to try to accomplish today. I guess unfortunately this video has a fairly low likelihood of us even seeing one worm. I mean, last time when we harvested this thing, we didn't encounter any worms within the compost, and it was for that reason we had deemed it to be a tub of finished compost. So this is really more about just trying to figure out if it's in fact dry enough for us to consider it as being done. And I guess the other thing that we would sometimes do in this case is just leave the material to sit in order to give time for any cocoons that might be in the material to hatch and for the baby worms to emerge. But I feel like I'm becoming a little bit disillusioned with that whole concept. I mean, I've got a tub on my shelf behind me. It's something I've been referring to as a so-called finishing tub. And the reason I call it that is because I had actually, taken a 205-day-old worm bin and transferred all of the finished castings from that tub after we had removed all the worms. And at that point, we had pretty much considered that as a batch of harvested compost, but we wanted to give that material some time to allow the worms to emerge and then for those baby worms to get baited out of the material. And I just feel like after 3 or so months of that happening, we've managed to pull a few worms out of that thing, but not enough to make it interesting enough. I think it's just, I'm just wondering if it's really a compelling enough reason to hold off on treating this stuff as done. In my mind, it seems like maybe finished castings simply have cocoons in them, and there's always that possibility that worm castings will eventually start getting populated with baby worms emerging from those cocoons. And that's fine. There's really nothing wrong with that. It's completely natural and completely expected when it happens. So I've taken all that dry stuff I scraped off the top and threw it into that opening I had created, so that now it's covered up with stuff that's more damp that had been pulled out from below. But I've got to say, comparing this stuff to what I had seen last time, it's certainly much flakier than it had been previously. It was very clumpy and muddy, and certainly not like this last time, that's for sure. And even though there's still some, material that looks a bit clumpy here and there, as we run into it and we give it a little bit of a jostle, you can see it's breaking up pretty readily into a fairly fine material, a nice loose compost. And it's not dry by any means. It's certainly got moisture content to it, that's for sure. And it makes me wonder if it's even necessary to leave this out on the shelf any longer. If I do, then it just might become overly dry, which isn't the end of the world either, but I think I just prefer finished castings to have a moisture content that's a little bit higher. Because, once stuff starts drying out, it becomes rock hard, and you don't want that. So it might be time for us to just simply move this stuff out of this container into one of my storage buckets and treat this as a finished batch too, and do away with this whole concept of letting it go through some sort of a finishing stage or anything like that. I mean, I'm not going to say that there was no value in allowing it time to dry out, because by doing so, I think we've definitely ended up with a much finer, higher quality product here, a much nicer batch of castings. Obviously, there's still some of those tougher, harder, dried out chunks that we pulled off the top surface and dropped down below the surface at this point, in the hopes that it'll catch some moisture, pick up some of the moisture from the other surrounding castings that it's mixed together with now. And then once it does, those little harder rock-like clumps can also be broken up pretty easily. Because right now, the way they are, they're just way too hard and way too dry. And I guess just by pretty much going through all the material just now, this really gave us a chance to verify and validate that there's no more worms in the material either, because I did not spot even one during the process of stirring this stuff around. So I believe that what we're left with here is what we could probably consider to be a finished batch of compost. And I think what I'm going to do actually now is just leave it in this tub a little bit longer, because I'm not really pressed for needing another empty tub right now. I can certainly just leave this material in here for a little longer, with only the objective of allowing the material to all equalize in moisture. Let that really dry stuff that we sunk below the surface, give that time to sort of hydrate a little bit, and then I think the next time we come in here, and it probably won't take more than a couple days, I think the next time we come in here, all those little chunks will more readily just flake apart like this. You grab one of those larger hard chunks that we sank below the surface, and we'll be able to just take those and crumble them into a much more fine material. And then what we'll be left with is a really nice batch of castings, all nice and consistent in its size and its moisture level and everything else. But I also don't want to lose any moisture at this point. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually restore a plastic covering to this bin, just so that the moisture that's in here already can remain in the bin rather than continue to evaporate, because I don't want to have just a surface with more dry material on the top. I'd really like for this stuff to come to the point where it's all kind of equal in moisture level, and then I could just put it into storage. So for now, it's going to sit in this bin, but at least now I've got a handle on, you know, where it stands and where it's going and what I'm doing next. So I think that also leads to the fact that maybe my record keeping can also stand to be improved a little bit, because maybe the one thing that's really missing is that, you know, while I've got a terrific record of what's been done in the past, I somehow occasionally do lose track of what the next steps were. And if not for the video that I shoot, and without the ability to sort of hit the rewind button and go back to what I had done and what I was saying, I would have totally lost track of what the next steps on this bin were meant to be. So that's just some more food for thought in terms of, you know, potential improvements for my record keeping system. So we'll see. We'll see if I can come up with any sort of practical ideas that I could put into action and maybe help myself going forward in the future. So I don't even know if this sort of content would be of any interest to anyone. It was just kind of an oddity, because I usually am pretty on top of what's going on and what I'm planning to do next. I think it was just in the case of this bin right here that I kind of left it in limbo and consciously decided to push the decision-making process on it, you know, down the road, and then it just slipped my mind. So I think that's perfectly normal. I don't think I'm losing it, or at least I hope I'm not losing it. All right, everyone, I'm going to leave it at that. Hopefully you enjoyed this quick video. If you did, then please remember, as always, leave me a quick thumbs up. I always really appreciate that. Also, consider subscribing to my channel. That's really appreciated too. All right, I'm going to go find myself a piece of plastic to put on this thing, and it's going back up on the shelf. All right, everyone. Thanks so much. Have a great day. Bye now.